FAS Research Professional Services focuses on analyzing networks.
Right.
What insights does a network perspective offer for innovation?
Well, it all boils down to what we call link diversity, right? If you want to have innovation, innovation is not a thing, it's a process. And this process only works if you have this variety of roles that's required to actually move an idea or an invention to what we call innovation. This is something that requires a variety of different roles and types and characters. You almost could say archetypes with network analysis you can look at, okay, what is the portfolio of our ecosystem, of innovation ecosystem, who we are connected with and who is missing out in order to have a successful process from new idea invention to actual success at the markets.
So it's not just about analyzing networks, it's about designing networks.
It's actually a kind of, we call it ecosystem design, right? It's really like when you cook something you need your ingredients, and I think we know quite well what kind of ingredients are required nowadays to have a thriving, innovative ecosystem. And when we look at ecosystem, it's not just like how organizations are linked with their environment, with the stakeholders, with the vendors, etc., but also like the internal ecology. There's not something like one ideal network structure, because when you move through those different stages from like, okay, we generate new ideas, okay, you need an open network, so serendipity is important. You want to be like inspired by random people so they'll have new ideas. But once you generate ideas, you need, and for that you need an open network. A place is required where you can actually condense and focus. So a quite dense network is required with specialists where we work together, not large. Think about those famous skunk groups, those small teams of like not more than 3 to 5 people who are most of the times responsible for breakthrough innovation. So, and then you need like places where people kind of actually disconnect from the environment, have the opportunity to surrender and work very closely together. And once you have this moment of condensation, sooner or later you need feedback from the markets, from the customers. It's all about, are we capable as an organization to have the inner variability to establish different networks, network morphologies with different network cultures. As I said, once it's about opening up, then it's more like about boiling down, selecting, focusing, then again opening up. So it's like this dance, this flow that's required.
So if a network goes through these different stages, does this mean that the individual company also has to go through the same different stages, even the companies which are linked in a network, then do they have to follow the same kind of phases of openness and closing? And how do they ensure that they act in a coherent and even similar way?
If we know that we need variety, and that's like, okay, we need the out-of-box thinker, who constantly have new ideas, and he's like a pain in the ass for like when you're like managing innovation process and you're the controller and you're responsible for like the process. You will have like this guy who's constantly spitting out new ideas. So, but we need him, right? But then you need those guys who said, okay, new idea, let's give it a try, let's implement, let's do something with it. Let's not just think, but let's do it. And then you have those guys who said, okay, but what's the business model? So what about the numbers? So is the market out there? So all the marketeers who start to think about, okay, is there again a business model? And there's another group, and this is a very important one. Each time you come up with a new idea, every innovation disrupt somebody. Somebody in your organization will kind of be like, they don't need me anymore. So there will like people out there who are frustrated, who feel rejected because of all those new ideas, because they would like to hold on what is, on the status quo. So if all those different people, and when you think about the product life cycle, and when you think about the process of innovation, all of those guys, all of those characters will be part of your ecosystem, and you have to have. And now talking about coherence, and now you have a strategic understanding it's a leadership requirement to know we have to manage this variability, and we have to communicate why we need all those different people who not necessarily like each other because they have different mindsets, different culture. But you have to tell the story. That's the only way to really move through those cycles of innovation. It's actually a make or break of, are we able to move through product life cycles, through innovation cycles or not? And how fast are we capable to move through those cycles? And for that, we need a highly flexible portfolio of leadership styles, because each of those different stages requires, as we said before, a different culture. So it's not just like, we cannot be just like a one-trick pony. That's also something like what I always think about when I say, oh, everything has to be agile today, right? Yeah, but there's moments where we should not be agile, right? So there's moments where it's about like, no, like stick with it, like freeze it, hold it for a moment. And then we have to, again, like be highly agile. So it's not an either or, it's more like a portfolio.
What kind of skills, what kind of qualifications are needed that people are able to dance with systems?
We have to learn to learn. That's how it is, because products come and go, new technologies come and go, but our capacity and capability to be part of the next and the next product life cycle has something to do with our capacity to learn. So what we have to bring to the table to learn. It's all about, again, this capacity to know and understand when it's time to move slow and when it's time to move fast, when it's time to think big and when it's time to think small. It's like this capacity to hold those opposites and understand that those opposites, they have their own time. They have the moment when they're required. It's like you have a tool set and you know there is a time when we need the hammer. But then there's the time where we need, like, I don't know, this specialized tool. There's no right and wrong, but there's a moment where things are right and wrong, but not generally. So it's like a quite sophisticated thing. So black and white thinking is not a good idea in this world, because it just like creates a lot of conflict and just increases transaction costs. So you need people who understand, of course, the system's behavior, the pattern, who have capable for systemic thinking. I think systemic thinking, your discipline, and it's just like absolute requirement for that. But there's one thing that's probably even more important, and this is not something that has to do with the skill, but with our leadership capacity and the culture. If you have this variety of people, right, and you have those different stages, and you have this innovation cycle. So, as you said, how to keep this thing coherent? How to keep those different mindsets aligned? And there's something that we know actually from military, and it's called situation analysis. So we have to be able, as an organization, to work on our situational awareness. So if you have those different kind of people in the room, just like invest time in, have those shared situational awareness meetings. Because if we don't work on the now, if we don't work on what we see now at this moment, it's quite futile to think about future strategies and where we want to head and what our plans are and where we want to go if we don't agree where we stand in this moment, where we start. That's like if we don't agree on where we are at this moment and we can locate ourselves in time and space at this moment, how could we even think about that it's possible to successfully move together into the future? So we would have a very quite confused process, and that's what's happening, unfortunately, many times. You have all those conflicts. We start with the strategy, and then we want to implement it, and then everything starts to fall apart because we have different understanding of what the actual goals are. There's quite a lot of reasons why there's misunderstanding, because you have those different characters that don't establish this shared situational picture of what is.
In networks, sometimes companies collaborate that know each other, and there might be others who compete. Are networks places where competitors can collaborate?
If you're too focused and too fixed on your competitor, this usually is a sign of weakness and a sign of that something is wrong in your culture, because you should not compare yourself with others. You should compare yourself with who you were yesterday. So you should establish your own scales and your own benchmarks. If you don't do it, you usually have a weak culture. It's not healthy to compare yourself too much with others. You should know what others are doing. You should respect them. You should see where they're good at. If you resent others, not a good idea. It's not, because that's not a learning attitude. So you should think about what you can learn from others. But then very, very quickly focus on yourself. And when you look at innovation cultures in organizations that are actually successful, they ever found a way to establish their own style, find their own voice, do it their own way. So that's like successful organizations. When I talk about successful organizations, I mean organizations that are successful over many innovation cycles. So it's easy, it's not easy, but it's one thing to have a startup and grow it, scale it, and to sell it. But the real deal is if you start a company, scale it, be successful, and paying and experience a disruption, a decline, go through those really difficult stages of being not successful, but then have the capacity to reinvent yourself, find a new path. So this is where the real deal is. And those companies who manage to go through those cycles again and again, they all have a very specific, very special culture. Has a lot to do sometimes with the region where they're embedded in, has to do with local relationships, with the quality of life there, and they find their own voice. And I think that's super important. Again, to be too much focused or even obsessed with the competitors, not healthy.
You mentioned network morphology. You mentioned before that networks have some kind of archetypes.
Yes.
Which network morphology has the highest potential for innovation, and where does radical innovation in networks come from?
You can think about three types of networks. Think about a network that's completely atomized, right? Nobody's linked with no one. You just have like nodes that are not connected. So isolation. Then you have like a network that's quite sparsely connected and what we call a structural whole network, where you know people, but they are not linked among each other. So you collaborate with others, but they are not collaborating within. So it's quite star-like networks. And then you have networks that we call closure networks, that are networks that are where everybody collaborates. So very densely linked networks. And if you combine those three archetypes, you get what we call a structural fold network, which is like you have highly dense networks that overlap. So you have an intersection of, and you have the combination, therefore, of cohesion, of having a cohesive, highly linked network with the variability and flexibility of structural whole networks. So the one that tend to be more open, the one are more inwardly oriented, etc., etc. And when you have those structural fold networks, you have like this combination of agility, flexibility, and robustness. So, and there are usually those structures that manage to move and shift different morphologies successfully. Having said that, in order to establish a structural fold network, this is not an easy thing, and it doesn't come out of nothing. So there's a lot of what we call network throughput, TNT, total network throughput. There's a lot of energy required, a lot of resources to establish structural fold structures.
So if such a structural fold network is the most innovative one and
Yes.
the most resilient one,
Yes.
how could the European Commission, how could Europe foster such a culture? How could it stimulate the formation of such networks?
This aspect of time, so you could almost say time is creating those structural fold networks. It's time is creating it. And if we have no time, if we have just those short-cycled projects that we see, you will have highly hierarchical, structural whole networks, as I said before, like those thinly networks grouped around like some, I don't know, important universities. And you will have a lot of atomized networks, but you don't get those structural fold networks. So it's really difficult because you have to produce them and you have to give them time. Because this is also, because you've asked me where do radical innovations come from, right? This was your second question. They come from two places and they kind of even contradict each other. One place is they came from the periphery. So the really radical new comes from the desert. It always comes from a place we haven't looked at. It's always like at the fringes where people were forced to really recombine really radical things, recombine things really radically in order to make a difference. So if you have nothing to lose, you risk more, something like that. That's one place where the new comes from, but when you look at the evidence, the most radical innovation comes from military research. And why? Because the average time of a project in the United States in the military sector is 2 or 3 times as long as in the civil sector. So they work for 10, 15 years. When you look at the DEPRA projects, it's not unusual that you have projects for 20 years.
Responsible innovation is an issue that has been put forward by the European Commission for the last 5-6 years. So bringing a more responsible attitude into innovation activities, talking about desirability and social acceptability. Can networks support an orientation towards societal needs?
I think what the aspect of responsibility comes into our network science is really when we talk about the shadow of the future. So what is the discount frame? So, and I think that our networks that are establish an identity that is built on values that are not just discounted for tomorrow, but have like this longer shadow of the future, they tend to be slower, right? Slower in terms of like interchange, but at the same time, of course, more robust, or have the capacity to align the network members. If you don't know who you are, if you have no story, if you don't know the values, if a network can agree on the values, and it's just like transactional, it's a very unstable, not sustainable network, because once the deal is done, the relationship falls apart. I think it's quite cynical, and empirically you can observe that it's always like money and meaning. It's always both components you find in those resilient networks. It's never just the transactional aspect. It's always this combination. And of course, where you have just like meaning and no money, that's a problem as well. That's what I said before when I talked about to establish those structural fault networks, you need this resource base.
Niklas Luhmann once said every system is constituted by a code, by just one code. Right. He talked about profit as the code of economy. Are networks focusing just on one code or currency, or are multi-fault networks also running on different currencies at the same time?
Super important question. It's never ever just one currency, and it's like where we have to bring Bourdieu into the discussion, because it's about, are we able to convert currencies? So structural fault networks convert the currency of the economic sphere into the currency of like the academia, or in the currency of culture. So you have all in those subsystems definitely your own currencies, your own, but your own scales, how I would call it. But in order to maintain a structural fault network, you have to learn to translate and convert different currencies, so it's always like multi-currency spaces. If we retrograde into a single currency systems, they lose their resilience.
Is one company capable of doing this conversion, or is this a capability of a network?
Those companies and organizations who are big enough and are around for a while usually manage to integrate all those different roles, usually through mergers and acquisitions. They renew themselves. All those attempts to bring in startups and have your hubs and your accelerators within are kind of attempts to kind of bring more variability in your own organizational culture. And therefore, if you understand that you have to establish or contribute to an ecology, this is another thing. You have to contribute, you have to give away. It's not just like a taking this establishing this mindset that an ecology is required, so that we stay capable to renew ourselves and go through those product innovation cycles again and again and again, is probably the most important mind change and mind shift that's required for the upcoming years. Because I mean, and this is like when you think about AI, when you think about the rise of China, and when you think about the challenging of climate disruption and all the problems we have with democracy and with our institutional setup here in Europe, we have to learn.
Innovation networks are regional phenomena, but also global phenomena. What is the role that the cultural background plays in innovation networks? Are they different when they are covering, let's say, the US, Asia, or Europe?
There's difference in the network culture because people have different relationships with what does it mean to be close, right? So there's like a difference in like our intimacy of a relationship, and when we talk about that we're friends or not friends, so there's differences. But usually it's like, as we know from studies of like innovation groups, great innovation teams or innovative teams, they develop their own language. That's what they call the pigeon language, right? Like they have their own slang, their own like abbreviations. When you listen to them, we don't understand them, and so it's not so much then the case of like, or it's an American and Chinese or European. So they usually, when they start to collaborate, they start to do their own thing, and otherwise it wouldn't work. So of course culture matters. If you are in an environment where think about this huge difference between European and American relationship to time and space, right? The Europeans, time is everything. Like we go back to, I don't know, to the Middle Ages when we start to think about the world, and space is always cramped, like we're here, like everything is small, right? And compare it with the United States, where space is endless, it reaches to the Mars. It's always like when they talk about space, always the whole world, they cover always the whole world, but time is totally limited. So they are not rooted, they have no relationship to the past, right? So it's a completely different cultural perception and different cultural interpretation or design of time and space. But once you bring those people together and you form a team, and you have those variety of mindsets and perception of time and space, I think something really, really genuine and special can emerge. And this is what's happening now in international research teams. You observe it all around, that they develop their own style, their own thing.
Considering networks in innovation and innovation strategies seems to be very promising. On the other hand, a lot of people think of innovation as a linear chain from invention to any kind of technology, and then the rest is done by the market. How could you help people that follow this quite simplistic understanding to open their mind for networks? Because the network thinking might simply overwhelm them. It might be too complex for them. What is the best appetizer to approach a network view?
Only complexity can manage complexity. What do we mean by that? If you have a super variable environment, you have to be even more variable than the environment in order to stabilize it. So you can't, if you say, oh, it's too complex, you need complexity in order to make things simple. That's like this hard lesson that we have to learn. If you have no model to reduce complexity in a robust way. So the process of simplification requires a lot of complexity. And that's why network thinking or system thinking is not just like, oh, there's those people out there who, want to make everything complicated because it's so easy. No, it's not so easy. But we use complexity as a tool in order to find a way, to figure out a way to keep things stable or to simplify things. It's like it's a story that you cannot simplify itself. You can't deal with the complex world using simple models. Not possible.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Andre.